Hello, I'm XPLovecat, and today I'm going to be walking you through Kenya for the Masks of Nyarlathotep series. If you've missed my other chapter breakdowns, they'll be in the description below. Otherwise, this video is going to be full of spoilers, so I'm assuming that you know the story up until this point, and you're here to learn all the tips and tricks that I learned through running the Kenya chapter. The setting for this chapter is Kenya, Africa, and most of it will take place in Nairobi. However, some of it will take place more in the wilderness, in the mountains or forest area, which is just about 70 miles north of the city. Investigators will be put to the test as they're hunted through the streets of Nairobi, and they're interviewing many different people to try and get a little bit more information about the Carlisle expedition. And it will eventually lead them to the dangers of the Mountain of the Black Wind, where they might have a chance to encounter the spawn of Nyarlathotep. Here are my thoughts on the length of the chapter and overall enjoyment of it. So this is actually the shortest chapter in the campaign, and we took about 3 to 4 sessions, or roughly 12 to 16 hours to play through this chapter. I actually found Kenya was one of the weaker chapters in this campaign, so you might have to do a little bit of extra work to bring it to life for your players. Now, also take this with a bit of a grain of salt, because Kenya was the last chapter that my investigators visited. And by that point, I felt like we were kind of getting into a loopy, Masks of Nyarlathotep state of mind. I don't know if that's a thing. Let me know down in the comments if you guys have experienced that with your own group. But we were nearing the end of this epic campaign, which we have been working on for a very long time. To add a bit more context around what I mean, my players decided to play the Scooby-Doo gang for this particular chapter, so that just gives you a little bit of a taste of the tone that we approached with this, and a little bit more goofiness that might have happened for our group that might not be the same for yours. However, I'll do my best to kind of walk through what I think are the most important tips during this chapter and give you a little bit of stories of what happened with my group. As always, I like to talk through the reasons to play and the reasons to potentially skip each of the chapters in the campaign. Starting with the reasons why you may want to play Kenya. The first is it's a pretty traditional chapter, and what I mean by that is it's a stop the cult goal. So we're going to spend time interviewing a lot of different people, investigating in Nairobi, gathering information to be able to find the location of the Mountain of the Black Wind. And by the time you get there, your objective is to stop the cult. We don't want this spawn of Nyarlathotep raining chaos down on the world, so that is your main overall goal with this chapter. I felt like it was a very epic showdown and an epic location, investigators versus the cult, and it felt very traditional Call of Cthulhu-y. And of course, if you want all of what Masks of Nyarlathotep has to offer and you want to play the entire campaign, you will obviously want to spend some time here in Kenya. Reasons why you may want to skip this chapter. The first is it's pretty heavy in interviewing a lot of different people at the beginning of the chapter. So it felt kind of redundant and samey to go and travel in Nairobi and track down these different people and have pretty basic quick conversations, but not actually get to know any of the NPCs very well. So the beginning part of this chapter might not be as fun for some groups depending on your playstyle. So just keep that in mind. You may also want to skip if you have players who are afraid of losing their investigators to either death or insanity, because I will tell you this chapter is pretty deadly if you do get to the Mountain of the Black Wind. And finally, if you are playing a condensed version of this campaign, Kenya is a chapter that you would be okay to skip. My number one tip here is if you do decide to skip it, to have a different fate for Hypatia Masters. Kind of come up with a different ending for what happened to her or move her to a different location. Here are my setting callouts for this chapter. Kenya is located on the equator, which means it has a very diverse climate. It has savannas, rainforests, swamps, deserts, and mountains. So spend some time bringing these different biomes to life and spend a little bit more effort in describing the differences between these locations so that it really feels like your investigators are adventurers, or they are people who have to traverse these different areas to be able to get to their final destination. in the mountain. The cult in residence here is the Cult of the Bloody Tongue. Now, this is the parent branch of the Cult of the Bloody Tongue, which also was in America. So go back, reference some of the things that you had in America when you played this cult, and feel free to carry those through in the cult for Kenya, including the weird headbands with the leather red strap that makes it look like they have a tongue on their head. What's unique about this cult is they flourish in the mountains. So unlike some of the other cults where they're very integrated within the city, and they have a lot of different operations or headquarters within the main places that your investigators are spending time in, this has the cult really in this condensed area with the mountain. So I felt like that gave it a little bit of a more unique flavor, and really the only interactions they're gonna have in Kenya, Nairobi, is with the ancient trying to track them down and potentially attacking them so that they don't make it to the mountain. On to key NPCs. My number one tip for you here, especially in the beginning part of this chapter, is there's a lot more minor NPCs than you're used to in other chapters. So spend some time making sure to differentiate these different minor NPCs and how they would be fun to interact with your players. This would include pre-planning some of the predisposition to your investigators, as well as possibly different posture or voices, something that will make them stand out and be fun to interact with as they go from person to person, interviewing and trying to learn about the Carlisle expedition. There are 3 major NPCs I want to hit on, and the first is Old Bandari. He is full of lots of information, so definitely pay attention to page 423, which has really useful information, questions, and answers that the players might ask. My number one tip is to make it not so difficult for the players to know that Old Bandari exists. I felt in the chapter he was hidden behind several walls, and so it was a little bit more difficult to influence the players to spend the time and effort into going to see him. But he has really vital information that could help your group get through this chapter, find the mountain, and know a little bit more of what to expect. In terms of portraying him, he spends a ton of time in a very meditative state, so it would be useful for you to perhaps get in that state of mind as well and think about how that person would portray the information and really engage your players into this unique personality. A quick story from my table: I really wanted my players to visit Old Bandari because he had such great information, and I also thought it would be a really fun interaction to have. But my players had already been to China at this point, and they had a map that told them where the Mountain of the Black Wind was located. So they didn't find it was relevant to spend the time to actually go and see him. So I actually missed out on this part of the campaign. But either way, I hope that these tips are helpful for you for if your group does stumble upon them. Next is Tan KR, who is an agent of the Cult of the Bloody Tongue, and she takes it upon herself to eliminate these investigators. She is very aware that they are on top of what's going on and they're trying to stop what the cult is trying to achieve. And therefore, KR is very confident that she is going to be able to take care of them. In this chapter, the High Priestess is extremely strong. So I really felt like using Tan in this chapter in the beginning part was more beneficial than immediately sending the High Priestess after them. So although in the chapter it says that KR may or may not tell the High Priestess about the investigators, I really focused on her thinking that she could take care of them all herself before going and asking for help. This gave the investigators a chance to actually find the information before they were bombarded by attacks that they really couldn't handle at this point. And a tip as you're playing her is she may try to infiltrate the group and act as a guide for Kenya. So this is likely a very foreign environment for your investigators. So it might be a good option to try and weave her way into the group and sabotage them that way. Next is Mariru, who is the High Priestess of the Cult of the Bloody Tongue, and she is excessively strong. Unlike some of the other chapters like England or Egypt, where the cult leader will probably hold back some of their power and not go full force on the investigators, Moriru has no time for negotiating. She is going to be very deadly, and she has a lot of access to magic points due to the stone altar at the Mountain of the Black Wind. So just be very aware of that as your players are planning to interact with her. And on that note, don't be afraid to use it. Call of Cthulhu can be a very deadly game, so this is just a really cool opportunity to show the power of this cult and what Moriru can really do. And the book offers some great solutions in the conclusion if you do end up having a total party wipe. Next is key locations. The first point I want to make is around Mombasa, which is a potential stop along the way to Nairobi for your players. But I personally didn't use this because there wasn't a lot of clues. Really the only link is the Emerson imports from the American chapter. So if you want to move this warehouse, which doesn't have any clues in it, to Nairobi, that might be more appropriate for your group so that they can really settle into this one city. Otherwise, feel free to spend a little time in Mombasa, but I wouldn't say it's essential for this chapter. And as your investigators travel to Nairobi, this is where they recommend having the first attack take place from the agent that is hunting down your investigators. She will most likely summon some fire vampires to try to take care of the situation. I really liked this first attack. It took place on the railway, and it really spiced up the travel component of this game. And it's a good reminder that you can use travel to your advantage. So if you're in between chapters, you can use travel to introduce additional clues or clues that they had previously missed. Also, this is a good chance to have consequences follow your players. So if there's something they did in a chapter that really stuck with your group or really made an impact, perhaps have a cultist follow them to their next location, or have whatever happened in that area follow them throughout the travel scenes, so that it can bring life to this whole epic campaign. The second attack from the agent is recommended to happen at the Nairobi Star. However, that felt a little bit early to me in this chapter. It felt pretty closely linked after the first attack. So I gave it a little bit more breathing room before I went right in with that second attack. So just feel out your table and see where you feel it would be appropriate to fit in the second attack from the agent. Then your players will arrive in Nairobi. And my tip here is to take advantage of page 402, which has all of the notable locations in this city. It can really help to immerse your players and be a great guide for where your players are going to talk to each of these minor NPCs. It might be helpful to take this notable locations page and write notes as to who is each in these locations and what the main clues are from these conversations. That way it's easily referenced all on one sheet. Next is the government house, and this is where they're going to meet Neville, who investigated the Carlisle Expedition massacre. Now, what's really funny about this is he is so sure that this massacre was caused by the white gorilla cult. So it might be fun to kind of bring the second cult into the mix. You might even spend a little bit of time fleshing out this white gorilla cult if your players latch on to this idea, and have them spend a little bit of time learning about this other cult and what their impact is in Nairobi. My tip here is to play Neville very passionately. He is extremely sure that it was the cult of the white gorilla, and it might just trip up your players for a little bit of time. Now, of course, don't let them go too far down this direction, but it's a little bit of a fun way to spice up Kenya and bring another entity into the mix. Next is Tankair's shop, which she sells tea. So if your investigators haven't caught on to this point, it might be nice to give them some different types of tea. Perhaps she tries to poison them, or perhaps she tries to put them to sleep so it makes it easier for her to capture them. Now, don't go too far with this, and give your players at least a chance to counter whatever tea concoction you might come up with, but I think it's a really fun way, if they haven't caught on to this point, that Care would try to take the investigators out. This location is pretty reminiscent of the Juju house back in New York, except there's nothing that explicitly links her to the cult here. The one important clue I want to point out is that they will find out the date of the eclipse, which is January 16th, 1926, and that is when the gate opening is planned. So that will give your players a more definite timeline if they haven't caught on to this already. Next is the Ndovu village. This is after they get through the forest area and before they hit the mountain. This is basically your last stop to prepare, get supplies, and listen to the lore and gossip of what's going on before they actually get to the mountain. This can be a really nice resting place, but also an opportunity to make sure that your players feel like they have the story and have all the information they would need to go head first into this pretty deadly mountain situation. And finally, we have the Mountain of the Black Wind. Something I would recommend is kind of tailor the experience to your group of how easy or difficult it is to find the location of where the cult is in this mountain. So dependent on how good of a job they did in prepping, in researching, and interviewing, will determine how easy it is for them to get to this location. Whether that is dex rolls, climb rolls, spot hidden rolls, anything that can add a little bit of mystery or difficulty if they haven't done a lot of prep work, I think is appropriate for your players at this stage. Make sure to use the map provided for the mountain and write some notes to yourself about where all the artifacts, the stone altar, and the different pits are located. And spend some time on the description of this cave weird system that's going on, because this is not a pleasant place to be for your players. It's cold and dark and damp and has a lot of unique smells, given that there is a monstrosity that is preparing the spawn of Nyarlathotep that's sitting in this area. Don't be afraid to spend time making sure your players know this is a very undesirable place to be. There will be a group luck roll to see if the High Priestess is actually in the cave at this time, or if she's off doing something else. Now, if she is there, there will also be guards. So this is where I say this could get pretty deadly pretty quickly if your players aren't super prepared for everything. There may or may not be rituals going on, so just pay attention to where you are timing-wise in the overall campaign and within Kenya itself. My group thought that dynamite would take care of the issue, but that was not enough to take care of the spawn of Nyarlathotep, and it ended up being unleashed upon Kenya. This was where the grand conclusion played out for my group, so I'll be making another deep dive into how to approach the grand conclusion at the end of all these chapter breakdowns. There is one sidetrack scenario in Kenya, and feel free to check out my guest blog post that I did on the Prospero House of why you should try and fit these sidetrack scenarios into your campaign. Overall, the Game Lodge, which was in Kenya, was my third favorite, and my other two were the ones in England. What I loved about this scenario is it showed the aftermath of what happened when Penhew and Houston actually tried to help. Endicott, who is the owner of the Game Lodge, was grieving the loss of his family and was opening up to Penhew and Houston when they came to visit at the Game Lodge. And they thought it would be a great idea to try out some of this new magic that they just acquired in Egypt and tried to raise dead. However, this is not an easy spell to pull off, and they kind of messed it up. So they ended up creating revenants instead. I found that this sidetrack scenario was one of the more difficult ones to resolve. And also, it was a battle to determine how much time your players actually wanted to commit to solving this issue, since it wasn't directly related to the main storyline. It's a battle between trying to solve it, which would involve them getting into the magic realm and potentially lose a lot of sanity, or trying to influence Endicott to walk away from his livelihood. They're both not really good situations, so it might be a little bit tough for your group to resolve. The story from my group, as you might remember, my players decided to play as the Scooby-Doo gang, so Velma got it in her head that Endicott was most definitely evil. She thought that he was behind these revenants and the murders that were taking place at his lodge. She lied to Daphne and gave her a gun, saying it was just full of tranquilizers and that it wasn't gonna hurt Endicott, just put him to sleep for a while. And Daphne, of course, would have no reason to suspect Velma was lying. And wouldn't you believe that Daphne rolled a critical? So poor old Endicott was murdered by the Scooby-Doo gang, and they didn't really get any of the background story of what happened at the game lodge. It happens sometimes, your players go off the rails. Like I said, loopy last chapter, but it was part of the fun and a story that I very much cherish to this day. When to know it's okay to move on from Kenya, here are the few things that you should keep in mind before your players move on. Number 1 is, have they destroyed the spawn of Nyarlathotep or prevented its birth? This is the main concept of this chapter, so making sure they've taken care of that in some capacity will be very important. I also think a key for this chapter is for them to feel that the cult is really starting to push back. So with the ancients' attacks and different things that they might encounter on their way to the mountain, that they feel like the threat is coming back on them now, as opposed to them just learning and investigating, which is more focused in the America-England chapters. And finally, they should leave Kenya knowing when the eclipse is going to happen, so they have this deadline in place and know how to approach the other chapters. And just so you all know, I recently launched a Patreon page. I'm saving up to hire a video editor for some of my videos so I can get content like this out there faster to you all. Thank you so much for your support, for watching my videos, and if you'd like to support me otherwise, you can go ahead and check out the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.